And joining us now on the line from Berkeley, California, Dr. Alison Gopnik. She is professor of psychology at the University of California, Berkeley, and the author of The Philosophical Baby. Dr. Gopnik, good to have you on TVO tonight. How are you?
Well, glad to be here.
I want to start by reading an excerpt of your book, and it goes like this. Philosophers have started to pay attention to babies and even to learn from them. The current encyclopedia of philosophy includes articles that are actually about babies with titles such as Infant Cognition and the Child's Theory of Mind. Thinking about babies and young children can help answer fundamental questions about imagination, truth, consciousness, identity, love, and morality in a new way. I want to ask you, I guess for starters, when the notion that babies are way smarter than we had previously given them credit for, when did that come to you?
Well, it's really been the last 20 or 30 years of developmental science that's completely revolutionized our ideas about babies. So 30 years ago, when I was, say, starting as a graduate student, most philosophers and psychologists would have said that babies were irrational and egocentric. They couldn't understand the difference between fantasy and reality. They were trapped in the here and now. And the last 30 years of science have really completely revolutionized our ideas about babies and have taught us scientifically that babies learn more, experience more, know more than we ever would have thought before. I think the people who took care of babies, moms, for example, always sort of suspected that there was more going on there than met the eye, but it was hard to prove that scientifically. If you just look at babies cursorily, the way that all those philosophers did, it doesn't look like there's much going on. But we've learned how to actually talk to babies in their own language. And once we did that, we found out that there was much, much more going on than we ever would have thought.
Well, follow up on that if you would. You talked to babies in their own language, and how did you do that, and what did that teach you?
Well, if you look at even very young babies, infants, of course can't talk yet, and even young children like 3- and 4-year-olds, if you ask them to tell you what they think, you'll get a beautiful stream of consciousness monologue about birthdays and ponies and things like that, but you won't get anything that makes much sense. So what we had to do was start looking at what children did instead of what they said. So with very young babies, for example, we could do things like look at what babies like to look at. And it turns out that babies like to look at unexpected things more than things that they expect to happen. With 3- and 4-year-olds, we would ask them to actually do something like make this machine go instead of asking them an open-ended question about, say, how did the machine work? And we discovered that by using those techniques, by looking at what babies and young children do and where they look, and asking them very focused kinds of questions, we could figure out a lot about what they were thinking. And what we discovered was that they thought and learned and knew more than we ever would have imagined before.
But I know you've given the example in your work of take an adult, put them in a foreign country where they don't speak a word of the language, where they have no money, they have no resources, they have no access to anything, and that's what it's like to be a baby today. Now, given that analogy, it's not unreasonable to assume that a baby is completely flummoxed or, completely out of their element, regardless of what they're doing and where they are. So again, where does this notion that they're somehow way smarter than we thought they were come from?
Right. So what we've done is we've actually started looking at what babies know, first of all, and even more importantly and more recently, how babies can learn. And although in one way it seems as if you might imagine that babies would be flummoxed, after all they have so much to learn, from an evolutionary perspective, it turns out that babies really are designed for learning. So one of the puzzles about human beings is why do we have childhood at all? I mean, after all, babies are basically useless. They don't do anything that helps to bring money into the household or take care of things.
Quite the contrary, actually.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, in fact, they're worse than useless in that we have to spend so much time and energy and work just keeping them alive. It seems like a very strange setup from an evolutionary perspective. And the answer seems to be that that long period of childhood, and we human beings have a longer period of childhood than any other species, is really designed to give us an opportunity to learn all the things that we need to learn about the world. So you could think about babies as being sort of the research and development division of the human species, and we're production and marketing. So they're the ones who are just free to learn without having to do anything, and we take all the things that we learned when we were babies, and we put them to use to do all the useful things that we can do as adults. And what that means is that babies seem to be very, very bad at things like planning or getting through the day. They have to depend on us to do that. And that makes them look kind of dumb and flummoxed. But when it comes to things like learning something new, babies turn out to be amazingly good, in some ways better than grown-ups are. So, for example, it turns out that even very young babies understand something about statistics, which is something that adults have an incredibly hard time doing. So, for instance, you can do this kind of experiment. My colleague Fei Xu at Berkeley wanted to see if babies could understand some very basic ideas about how statistics worked. So what she did was she showed the babies a box was 80% full of white balls and 20% full of red balls. Then the experimenter took some balls out of the box. And either the experimenter took out mostly white, 4 white and 1 red, or mostly red, 4 red and 1 white. Now, if you take out mostly white balls from a mostly white box, right, that makes sense, you'd predict that. But something unexpected has happened if you take mostly red balls out of a mostly white box. And it turns out that the babies looked longer if she took out the mostly red balls than if she took out the mostly white balls. So these very young babies, this experiment was done with babies as young as 8 months old, already could be sensitive to the statistics of what was going on around them in the world. A very, very tricky thing to do that even grown-ups can have a hard time with sometimes. But of course that makes sense. So you might think, gee, that's weird. Why would babies be paying attention to that? But it makes sense if you think about babies as being these really profound learners, trying to figure out how the world works. So in another follow-up experiment, what Fei did was to then show the babies a red ball and a white ball, and the experimenter put out her hand and said, "Can you give me one?" And if the experimenter had pulled red balls out of a white box, the children would actually give her the red balls. So they seemed to think, oh, okay, the only reason why she would do this weird thing, pulling out mostly red balls from a mostly white box, is if she prefers the red balls. So not only were children detecting the statistics, which is sort of amazing, but they were actually using it to figure out something very deep about what's going on in someone else's head. Now that's sort of, I think that is pretty amazing, but it's not so unexpected if you think how much children have to learn in such a short time. And learning things like learning what other people want, that's about as important a thing to know as you possibly could.
In which case, do you want to say that a baby's brain actually works the same way as an adult's brain does? Maybe not obviously with the level of sophistication, but the neurons that are firing in there, it's all the same?
Well, in fact, it turns out that in many respects, the baby's brains are smarter than grown-up brains. In the following sense, if we look at babies' brains, what we see is that babies' brains actually have more neural connections, more synapses than adult brains. And the way that brain development seems to work is that there's an early period when babies' brains are making lots and lots and lots of connections. And then what happens as we get older is that we keep the connections that we use a lot and we strengthen those connections. Those connections get to be very efficient and run off very quickly. And we prune, we get rid of the connections that we don't use. And what that means is that our adult brain is kind of this lean, mean machine that can do the things that it does extremely well and efficiently. But it's not flexible. For instance, as adults, if we have a stroke and have brain damage, it's very hard for us to recover. Babies and young children have the same kind of brain damage, and the rest of their brain will just reorganize itself to take over the function of the damaged part. When babies and young children have new information coming in, they're much better at being flexible, at saying, oh, okay, this is a possibility I hadn't considered, than we adults are. So if you're thinking about a brain that's really designed for learning, for flexibility, for imagining new possibilities, the baby's brain, in many respects, is actually a better brain for those purposes, even though it's not a very good brain for purposes like tying your shoes, which adults are much better at. So it's kind of like, instead of thinking about brain development as just being a process of simple growth, of getting a bigger and bigger brain, it's more like a kind of metamorphosis, like the difference between a caterpillar and a butterfly. The babies are really sort of designed to do different things than the grown-ups, except that you could argue that they're the ones who are the butterflies who are flitting around the world and exploring, and we're the caterpillars that are humping along our adult-defined working day path.
Well, you say they're better in many respects, but you know, admittedly rudimentary parenting experience suggests that when it comes to protecting their own health, they're incredibly stupid. They'll walk into traffic, they'll put their hands on stoves, they don't mind wandering away from their parents and getting lost. I mean, what's going on inside a baby's head that obviously gives them no awareness whatsoever of the level of safety they're involved in when it comes to their own health?
Well, right. So again, this is part of this fascinating division of labor that seems to be so characteristically human. So our children are terribly helpless and dependent on us for a really long time. And part of that is that the part of their brain that's involved in things like planning and focus and risk assessment and most notably something called inhibition, stopping you from following your impulses, that part of the brain is the prefrontal part. It's the part that's sort of in the front of the brain. And that's the part of the brain that takes the longest to develop. It's most distinctively human, and it actually takes a really long time to develop. So in fact, it's not finished until mid-20s. So I hate to tell you this, but you're going to be facing your children doing foolish, risky things for a long time now.
Yes.
So that it might seem sort of paradoxical. Why are children taking these risks? If you think about it from the perspective of surviving, it doesn't seem like a good idea. But if you think about it from the perspective of learning, one of the best ways of learning about the world is to explore. So from that perspective, being uninhibited is actually a good thing. So going out into the world, exploring, finding out what's happening in the world, doing the kind of risky behaviors that we call getting into everything, that actually is a very helpful thing if you're thinking about it from the perspective of a creature designed to learn. We've been collaborating with computer scientists at NASA who are trying to design ways of putting good brains in those little Mars rovers rovers that go to Mars and explore. And if you think about it, your average 2-year-old is a lot like that Mars rover. It goes out there and it toddles around and it gets itself into all sorts of trouble and mischief, but that's the best way to design a system that's actually going to be able to explore and learn new things. And just like those NASA controllers, we occasionally have to pick it up and set it upright and make sure it doesn't completely collapse into a crater.
Let's consider whether these very smart young babies and children need smarter parents. And to start that out, I want to read another excerpt from your book. For most of human history, you write, caregiving went way beyond just mothers or even fathers to include grandparents, older brothers and sisters, aunts, cousins, friends, the community at large. In fact, contemporary middle-class American society is very unusual in that so few people are involved in raising children. This may also explain why those who do sometimes seem to make such a fuss about it. At most times and places, parenting is something everybody takes for granted. But many modern parents seem to think it's another specialized profession to study for. There's nothing like the prospect of an exam to make you anxious and miserable. First of all, I find it funny that you're laughing at something that you yourself wrote, so obviously you like what you wrote. Number two, I want to ask you about helicopter parents, because we've heard this expression about parents who constantly hover over their children, and I don't know, you tell me, inhibit their ability to make independent choices and in the long run are not being helpful parents? Do you want to say that?
Well, I think it's tricky because, as I say, for most of human history, the way we learned how to be parents was the way we learned most things, which is we practiced when we were young and we watched other people doing it. And we're in a very strange situation now because people are so mobile and we don't have extended families anymore. We have lots of people who are having children for the first time who've never taken care of a child themselves and haven't even gotten a chance to witness very much caregiving, don't have younger brothers and sisters, don't have cousins and aunts and uncles who they could watch being involved in caregiving. And caregiving is a very interesting process because it involves this constant balance between protection on the one hand and allowing independence on the other hand. And it's a very hard balance to achieve. And it's the sort of thing that you have to kind of practice and see and do practically. It's not the sort of thing that you can do just from a prescription in a book. And I think part of what happens is that there's a generation of parents who are more anxious because they don't feel like they know how to do this thing. And of course are particularly anxious about the dangers that might be out there for their babies. So we have this kind of funny situation now where on the one hand, we're paying much more attention to babies and young children and fussing about them more. On the other hand, in some ways, we don't provide the kind of general support that we used to for babies. So in the old days, not that old, not so long ago, you know, there would be 40 mothers on the street, and if there wasn't the child's mother there to tell them what to do or to take care of them if they fell, there'd be some other mother there. So I think parents feel as if they've got all the burden of taking care of the children because the general community and society isn't doing the job for them. And they also feel as if that's a much harder job than maybe it used to be, although it's always been a hard job, hard part of the human condition.
Well, this is a horrible generalization to ask, but again, based on your both firsthand experience and anecdotally, do you think today's 30-something, 40-something parents, first-time parents, are too permissive?
Well, again, I think part of the trouble is that we act as if there's some formula, you should be this permissive or this authoritarian or something about what kind of caregiving would actually somehow lead to the best children. And that's not really the way that the science suggests that it works. It isn't the sort of thing where we have this very particular goal. We want to bring about children of a particular sort. In fact, caregiving's like any other relationship. It depends a lot on what the individual parent is like. It depends a lot on what the individual child is like. And at its best, it involves a kind of interaction between children and parents. One of the things I talk about in my book is the fact all these new studies which suggest that what happens in the end depends as much on the individual temperament and even genetics of the child's shaping what goes on in caregiving as much as the adult parent is. So really it's like saying, think about any other kind of relationship. Think about a marriage, for instance. You wouldn't say, okay, here's the formula. You should be more permissive or less permissive or more controlling or less controlling. What you'd say is the two people in the relationship need to work out a relationship that works for them, and that's the way that we end up with thriving babies and thriving parents.
Now, I appreciate that, but if the great breakthrough that we're learning now is that these babies are way smarter than we ever gave them credit for, does that mean we need to change the way we are caregivers, for example?
Well, it means that I think there's actually two messages that come out of this work, and in some ways they play against each other. One message is that all of the baby Einstein tapes and the flashcards and the things that people think, often when people hear how smart babies are, they think, well, what can we do to make them even smarter? And the answer is they're already as smart as can be, and the way they're learning is through their spontaneous exploration and play. So I do think one message, for example, is against this tendency to have earlier and earlier academics in preschool, both for parents and for schools. The idea that, your child needs to be reading by the time they're 3, or they need to be doing math in preschool. I think all that we know suggests that that's not true. The things that the children are learning about, the really important things, are things like how the people around them work, how the world works. And the way they learn that is by playing, by exploring, by finding out about the world. So in one sense, I think it means we should kind of leave our children alone more, let them explore and play. On the other hand, the other message is that in order for children to do that, they need to have this community of people around who care, who pay attention, who are involved and engaged with the children. And of course, that's something that we actually don't do very well nowadays because we don't pay parents anything to take care of their children, and we pay preschool teachers almost nothing. So we need to have more resources devoted to providing this rich, supportive environment for children. One of the things I say is that from an evolutionary point of view, that rich, supportive environment would probably involve more mud, livestock, and relatives than most of us could tolerate in a contemporary Canadian or American apartment. But at least have bean plants and butterflies and goldfish around for the children to find out about and explore.
No, but that's a good point. The reality is, I guess most people today want to move far away from their parents, or maybe have their parents less involved in the raising of their own children than perhaps was the case a couple of generations ago. But if what you're telling us is the way to go, we should be living very close to grandparents and aunts and uncles and having much more involvement widespread in the raising of our children. You're talking about quite a major rethink in the way that we live our lives today. Fair to say?
Well, we're not going to be able to go back to the days of mud and livestock and relatives. So I think what we really need to do is figure out ways in the communities that we're in now of recreating that sense of a village, of a community of people who are involved with children. And we could do that by having, say, preschools with lots of preschool teachers who were well paid and well supported and interacted a lot with the mothers, or by having workplaces where your fellow workers were involved in children as well. So somehow we have to have friends or coworkers or people involved in preschools taking over some of the roles that those cousins and aunts and grandmothers and parents once served in the past. Some way of having that sense of a broader community of people involved in raising children. And we need to provide much more support for mothers and fathers than we actually typically do.
Alison, in our last few minutes here, let's focus on children as the true researchers in science. And once again, I'm going to start with a quote from your book. If we focus on adult abilities, long-term planning, swift and automatic execution, rapid, skillful reaction to the deer and the tigers and the deadlines, then babies and young children will indeed look pretty pathetic. But if we focus on our distinctive capacities for change, especially imagination and learning, then it's the adults who look slow. The caterpillars and butterflies do different things well. Why do you think scientists are more successful when they emulate what children do naturally?
Well, I think all of us as adults in certain circumstances, and scientists most of all, can at times take on some of that childlike openness to possibility, curiosity, sense of exploration. And the great scientists often say that what they do is really a kind of play, and that they're emulating some of that childlike spirit of play. But I think it's important that it's not just formal scientists who do that. For all of us as adults, part of what taking care of children does is it puts us back in touch with that kind of openness, that ability to learn, that ability to change, that ability to imagine new possibilities. That's really a central part of what human beings are all about.
And how about, let's see how we do compared to other species. The learning cycle of humans compared to non-humans, how are we doing?
Well, of course, you know, we've only been around a tiny percentage as long as the dinosaurs, so I wouldn't want to say too much about how successful we've been so far. But certainly our trick, our great evolutionary advantage is exactly that we can escape the constraints of evolution. We can think of new ways that the world can be, and we can think of new ways that we can be. And it turns out that that capacity for human change, for imagining new possibilities and making them real, that's something that is rooted in the experience of childcare. So when we're taking care of those babies, it isn't just that we're keeping them alive and making peanut butter sandwiches. We're also enabling the whole human species to have culture, to have invention, to imagine new technologies, imagine new kinds of social structures. That kind of open-endedness and freedom that seems to be so human and differentiate us from the other animals. That's something that I think really depends on, is rooted in just that everyday fact of having little kids who are pretending and imagining and playing and exploring.
Gotcha. Dr. Alison Gopnik, good of you to join us on the line from Berkeley, California. Your book, once again, The Philosophical Baby, who we now learn is way smarter than we thought. Thanks so much for joining us on TVO tonight.
Well, thanks very much for having me.